All right, this video is going to talk a little bit about a method of how to factor a trinomial. So you'll notice we've got a trinomial on the screen here, 12x squared minus 7x minus 10. But how to factor that trinomial into two binomials. Now we know a couple of different methods. We can take a look back at an example if we want to of how to factor a trinomial such as x squared plus 17x plus 30. Right? Usually we look for what adds to the middle that multiplies to the end. Right? So we would look at this and say, well, what adds to 17 that multiplies to 30? Well, I know 15 times 2 is 30. So very simply, we could get an answer, right, of 15 and 2, right, x plus 15x plus 2, where x squared multiplies to that front term, 15 times 2, right, multiplies to 30 here, but x times 2 and 15 times x are going to add together, right? Those outside-inside terms add together and give you 17x. It's a little trickier than that, though, when our leading coefficient's not a 1. Because notice, again, if we did this multiplying over here at the left, right, we're going to get a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to go ahead and put this together. We're going to add those middle terms. But now the tricky part is if all I look at are the -1 and the -2, well, I'm not going to get that leading coefficient. I'm not going to get this 2x or this 5x, right? And notice that, again, the 4 and the 5 adding together, well, none of my numbers up here were 4s. So really, it kind of gets messed up. It gets a little bit trickier than it was before. So if we want to factor something like a 2x squared, we're going to have to incorporate that 2 into our process, right? And in order to do that, we've got a few different methods we can use. Now, this video, I'm going to talk about what's called the grouping method. And in another video, feel free, you can watch that video as well. We'll talk about a couple other methods called the swing method and the box method. And again, all three methods essentially do the same thing. So you can sort of pick your favorite. But again, knowing how to do all three means you really understand the process. So let's talk about grouping. The real trick to, again, that whole undoing the FOIL, right, or undistributing, is really the fact that that 12, again, is going to kind of mess up our process. So in order to do grouping, the first step that we're going to take is we're still going to say what's going to add to the middle. We're going to add to that middle term. But I also want to multiply. Now, here's where it changes from our previous process. I don't just want to multiply to -10. I want to multiply to -10 times 12. I'm going to put these two terms together. Right? And we're going to call that -120. And if you want to, you can even leave the variables on there. We could leave our x squared right over here. Right? We can leave our x squared on that 120. And then we can also leave the x on that middle term. It's not a bad idea. If we can find two numbers that are going to multiply correctly to -120x squared and add correctly to -7x, I will guarantee you that this trinomial is factorable. Remember, sometimes we can't even factor them because the numbers just don't work. I will guarantee you if we can do this process and find those numbers, I will guarantee the rest works. After that, we're just going to take a few extra steps compared to what we did previously. Right? In order to essentially work our way backwards, right, through this process. Think of it that way. We need to be able to split the middle, and then we need to be able to sort of backtrack our way back to two binomials. Well, let's think about our numbers here. What's going to multiply to -120? Well, I just like that 0 on the end. I'm going to start with -12 and 10, right? But adding those up, I would get -2, and that's not going to be my -7. So I need to be a little farther apart, right? We need to be farther apart. So how about -15, right? Because I do want the larger one to be negative, right? So that when I add those two numbers, that we will go ahead and get, a better number. Well, -15 times 8 will give us -120, and it turns out that one also adds together to -7. So those are my two good numbers. So now let's start the process of grouping. Here's why we call it grouping. We're first going to write down our first term, 12x squared. Then I'm going to take my -15, and don't forget it was x squared. We should actually put an x on both of those. We're going to call it -15x and +8x. I'm going to split the middle, right, into two parts. I'm splitting that negative 7 up into two parts. And then don't forget your negative 10 when you're done. Now we'll get the name here. We call it grouping for a reason. I'm going to group the first two, and I'm going to group the last two. Notice I'm leaving that plus sign in between them. It's really just all added together. But by grouping them, we're going to sort of narrow down what we're looking at. Now let's do some common monomial factors. Let's look at what we have in common. 12 and 15 both have a 3 in common. That we also have an x in both terms, so I'm going to take that out as well. And I'm going to leave behind then, right? I'm going to leave behind, well, if 12 divided by 3 is 4, I'm taking out an x, or I'm dividing out an x, so it leaves an x. Minus, I'm going to divide 15 by 3 is 5. And again, I'm going to take that x out of there. But if we redistributed that, right, 3x times 4x minus 5, we would end up right back here in this red stuff, right back where we started from. Then, let's go ahead and say plus, right, carrying that plus sign down. What do 8 and 10 have in common? Well, I know they're both even, so I'm thinking the biggest number that I can get out of both of those is a 2. Because I don't think they have anything else in common, really. There's just a 2. And notice this time I don't have an x in common, so I'm not going to worry about that. But I do need to figure out what's left behind here. Again, if we take 8 divided by 2, it should leave us with a 4 and an x. And if we take that negative 10 divided by 2, we're left with a negative 5 over here. Again, you could redistribute and make sure you get that right. But again, I like what that looks like. Now, here's the real key to the process. Notice in the first half and in the second half, still separated by this plus sign, right? We have something in common. Just like we had a 2 in both the 8 and the 10, just like we had that 3x in the 12x squared and the minus 15x, well, in the first half of this, we have a 4x minus 5. In the second half, we also have 4x minus 5. One of my two factors is going to be 4x minus 5. And if you think about it, we took out the 3's and we ended up putting them in front, right? Well, when I take out that 4x minus 5 from the first part, that just leaves me a 3x. And if I take out 4x minus 5 from the second part, right, it just leaves me with that 2. Hopefully you noticed that. Again, here's that 4x minus 5. If we remove both of those, right, all we're left with in red is that 3x plus 2. And that, or those, would be our factors. Okay. Why don't we go back to the previous screen and go ahead and see if that works for this problem at the bottom. Go ahead and get ahead of me if you want to. You can pause the video now. In just a minute, I will go ahead and solve that or factor that problem at the bottom. Remember, we want to end up with two binomials, right, when we're done. Now, we're going to start off saying again what's going to add to the middle and what multiplies to the ends. So that's negative 4. The only thing I know to multiply to negative 4 would be either a 2 and a 2 to get to 4 or a 1 and a 4. And if we're going to multiply to a negative and add to a negative, the bigger one better be the negative, right? And I'm thinking that 1 and negative 4 looks pretty good. So we'll keep our 2x squared. We're going to say plus 1x and minus 4x. I'm taking my two numbers from down here and separating that middle term. Don't forget your minus 2. In the first two terms, there's an x, which leaves behind 2x plus 1. In the second two terms, I see a negative 2. So I'm going to pull out a minus sign along with my 2. Negative 4 divided by negative 2 is positive 2x, and negative 2 divided by negative 2 would be a positive 1. Again, you can always redistribute if you're not sure where I got all that. Notice we got a 2x plus 1 in both parts. That's our common binomial. And the leftover stuff would be an x and a minus 2. And hey, look, I bet if you FOILed, we'd get right back to the original. Again, that's how to factor by grouping. Feel free to talk to your teacher if you have any questions, and make sure you watch the next video. I'll show you a couple other methods very similar to grouping, but they're called the swing method and the box method, and hopefully they'll give you another idea of how you can factor trinomials when the leading coefficient, right, when this number in front of x squared, isn't a 1.